Hello and welcome back to the Wise Money School. Today I'm going to break down a question I get asked a lot these days is, should I buy or should I rent? Just this week, I saw two headlines on this very topic. One was from Wellthy that said rent, don't buy, and another financial leader, Morgan Housel, who said the same thing, rent, don't buy. And yes, they're saying housing prices are at an all-time high, interest rates are high, inventory is at a low. So yes, it is expensive to buy today. So part of what I think Morgan's selling or telling us is like, because of these factors, it might not be the best time to buy. You might wait till later. What Ramit is basically saying is he just doesn't really believe in home ownership in general. So I'm biased. I'm biased because I love real estate. Real estate's made me wealthy. And I started buying real estate when I was very young. I've encouraged my kids to buy real estate. And I don't know, maybe it's because even when I was little growing up, we were in a trailer home. I think you know that by now. And so we didn't own anything. And we just moved from place to place to place. We never had roots. My brother and I, we just never felt grounded, I think, because we're just being passed along to the next apartment or the next little rental house or whatever it is. So yeah, like just personally, I love the idea of real estate ownership, but I love it more than just these feelings. Number one, there's a really important reason why we want to buy real estate as opposed to renting. And that has nothing to do with what I'm going to break down here to see what makes more financial sense just on paper. But here's the thing, the reason why, like fundamentally, we want to buy a house is because we buy a house when we're younger and it's a fixed rate. And let's just pretend for this example that we buy a house and we hold it for 30 years. So that's where the American dream was created, that's what's amazing about here in the US is that we really have this ability to buy a home. And that's why it's called the American dream, is to buy and own a home. So back in the day, you could buy a home, you would have a job, basically you'd work for the man for 30, 40 years, and then you'd buy a home, you'd have a fixed 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and you'd work, and at the end of 30 years, more or less, you would retire soon after that, and by the end, your house was paid for. So people back in the day, they didn't move houses like we did today, but that was the idea, and that's what was so great about living here in the U.S. is that you could buy a modest home and you could pay it off and you own your home. Now things have changed. We buy homes, we move more often, so that's not necessarily applicable. But the idea is the same, is because we want to buy a home when we're younger and use that 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that payment more or less stays the same while the appreciation of the house goes up. And we're doing that because when we're younger and we're making more money and we're doing all the things, then our mortgage is almost always our biggest payment. Our mortgage or our rent is our biggest monthly payment. So when we know we want to retire 30 or 40 years later, we want that highest payment out of our monthly expenses to go away. So if you rent for 30 years, you're going to pay rent till you die. You're never going to own anything. And that high payment, that high monthly payment, that expense every month is never going to go away. If you own a home, for example, and you pay off your home in 20 or 30 years, then you own the home. So that large monthly expense that goes out every single month, you don't have it anymore. So you get to live off that money. So that's ultimately like the fundamental financial reason why we want to buy a home and pay it off, is so that we can live in our home rent-free, basically, when we're retired. And all you have to do is cover taxes and insurance, but you own your home. And the bank can't take it away from you, which is nice. And the bank can't kick you out. As long as you're paying your taxes, you can stay in that home until you die. So that's why we want to buy a home. And we ultimately want to own it. So that's number one. Number two, you will own nothing and you will be happy. This is something else if maybe just Google this. Google, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And I think this came out of the World Economic Forum. And it's kind of this global mindset that was trying to be pushed, is to tell all of us that you will be happy. You don't own anything. You don't need to know anything. You'll just rent everything about your life and you'll be happy because you won't be so dragged down by this ownership. And my thinking to that when I heard that was like, well, who owns everything then? Somebody owns all the stuff that we're renting. If we're renting our cars and we're renting our houses and we're renting our clothing and we're renting our computers, who owns it? So somebody has ownership and we're paying. We never own anything. We pay for that. And a wealth principle, if you haven't watched this video, watch this video where I talk about I own that. And it talks about wealthy people own assets. To be wealthy, it's all about ownership. And so we have to own and want to own because we want to build this net worth and gain ownership and over assets over time. And that ultimately is what creates our financial freedom, financial security, and everything that I teach here on this YouTube channel. But that's just the mindset. The mindset is ownership. So like I said, I'm biased. I love ownership of real estate and I just love ownership of assets. And that's the mindset. Why do we want to rent? Why do we want to buy versus rent? Is because, like I said, 30 years, we can own this. Number two, wealth is creating ownership. So we want to own our home. But now let's just break it down and see, okay, when we break it down to the numbers, which just taking away these other two things I just talked about, what makes more sense? Renting or buying? All right. So lots of numbers here. Please be nice to me. I'm not a math person. And that might be a little, aha moment there is that multimillionaire, I'm not great at math. So I'm going to ask, please be nice to me with my math. And then number two, these are just generalizations that I'm putting here on the board. Meaning you could pick these apart if you wanted to, but I'm just asking you not to. I'm just doing some very simple math and putting some concepts up here to get you thinking. And I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just saying, hey, when I saw these headlines that should I rent and don't buy, I thought, well, let me just break it down and see what happens. So that's what I'm sharing here with you today. So I guess that's my disclaimer. So what I'm looking at, I did some research and the median price in the US right now is $440,000. So not inexpensive. It's almost doubled in the last probably 10 years or so. But that's a median price across all of the country. Now, of course, some cities are more expensive to the other. You can get a house, I think, in Houston for probably, more the median price is like $280. Dallas might be closer to $300. So there are cities that have lower prices, but the median price across the board, factoring in the Californias and, the Northeast and different things have higher prices. This is the median price, $440,000. So let's say you're a first-time home buyer, and that means you can buy a house for 5% down, and that is $22,000 on a $440,000 home. Now, when you buy a home, you also have something called closing costs, and closing costs are just the cost to buy the home, which would be working with the lender, and which would be appraisal costs. And there's just all these different costs that are the fees to buy a home. So we're looking at that. I just factored in on a $440,000 home, your closing costs at 5% or $22,000. Your down payment and your closing costs are $8,800, which means you're out of pocket $30,800, $31,000. So yeah, that means if you're going to be a first-time home buyer, you need to start saving for that down payment. But this is the amount that we're going to put into our home just for the privilege, basically, of buying it. All right. So, but we just want to remember this number, this $30,800 number. So now I'm going to break down what would be the monthly payment on a $440,000 home. You paid $440,000, but the loan after putting the $22,000 down is $418,000. So your monthly expense on that $418,000 loan is your principal and interest are going to be about $2,650. But if homeownership wouldn't be that expensive if all we had to cover was the principal and interest, because that's not a huge number in the grand scheme of things. But when we own a home, we have to pay more than just the principal and interest. So what else do we have to pay? We have to pay property taxes, and property taxes are a pretty big expense for home ownership. So in the case that I used here, It's an additional $500 a month just for the property taxes, in addition to what you're paying the bank for the principal and interest. Then you have insurance. Insurance, I just used a number here of $175. There's something, if you put less than 20% down for home buyers, there's something called PMI, or private mortgage insurance. And so for the first 10 years or so, until you get that 20% equity, you're paying this extra amount called PMI, and I just put that as about $150. And then maybe there's an HOA or just some random expenses there. So this is all of the different parts of your monthly payment. So in this example here, this equals $3,500. So this is your monthly payment that goes to pay your rent, tax, your principal, your interest, your taxes, your insurance, and all the goodies. Now, another privilege that comes with homeownership as opposed to renting is something called repairs. And when you buy a home, there's always little repairs, little things going wrong, even in new houses. But I like to use 1% of the sales price as a kind of a monthly amount to budget towards repairs. So in this case, I use $440, and that means we're at $39.40 per month for our total mortgage outlay, right? All right, so $39.40 for a $440,000 house. But here's the thing that I'm not sure, like in Ramit's example, he's not factoring in these other benefits of home ownership, financial benefits of home ownership that you don't get with rent, for example. So if we look at this, we have $39.40, which is our total monthly payment here. But now what's going to happen is, in the example that I'm using here, when I did a Google search, and the Google search that said, on average, the American homeowner spends 13 years in their home. So I just did all of this math based on 13 years. So 13 years for a $440,000 house, where we put the 5% down at the $418,000 loan amount. Over 13 years, we would have paid $92,000 towards principal. So in this $26.50 payment every single month, you're paying, that's called principal and interest. $26.50, a portion of the $26.50 goes to principal. I mean, just paying down the principal amount on the $440, and the other part is the interest. And I used a 6.5% interest rate because that's what mortgage rates are at the time of doing this video. All right, so in this case, our total cost that we're using here, even including monthly repairs, is $39.40. But over that 13 years, you're going to put $92,000 towards the principal. So what we want to do is we want to deduct that from this monthly amount, because we're basically going to get that money back when we sell the house. And that's where the house is great, because it's kind of like forced savings in a way. You're putting money into this principal, and this amount is going down. So now another thing that you get when you buy a house is there's tax deductions. You can deduct based on whatever your effective tax rate is. You can deduct some interest. You can deduct some property taxes. You can deduct some PMI. So I just put $500 in different types of deductions as part of this example. But yeah, there's some tax incentives for home ownership that you don't get when you rent a home. And the final thing here is that our homes appreciate. So inflation's 3% a year on average. So I just used a 3% appreciation rate. And if we own our home for 13 years with a 3% appreciation rate, our $440,000 house is going to appreciate to $646,000, which is a $206,000 gain. So that means over 13 years, our home appreciated by $206,000. So if I take that $206,000 gain and I divide it by 13 years, which is 156 months, that is $1,300 a month. So these are the financial rewards I get from home ownership. So yes, my total payment here is $39.40, that outlay every single month. But if I look at this after 13 years, what it costs me effectively on a monthly basis, we take out the $591, the $500, and the $1,300, And what that does is this takes us down to, I think, 1349. I think that's close to that. You do the math, but somewhere close to that. So look at this. That's a big number. Is we have 3940, which is our monthly, but after 13 years, if we're to back out these things, our monthly effective payment is 1349. Big difference, right? I mean, not that bad. But now something we're trying to get as close as possible, factoring all the different costs. What's going to happen is when we sell our house after that 13 years, there's going to be closing costs. And it just like there's cost to buy a home, there's cost to sell the home. So in this example, I did closing costs. I think I did 4.5% total closing costs on $646,000 divided by the 13 years is $165 a month, how that would average out. So what this does is this takes us to $1,714 total payment. Caveat, these are really rough numbers to make a point. Yes, taxes and insurance might go up over the 13 years. Yes, closing costs may or may not be that amount 13 years from now. But again, just bear with me just to follow the example here. All right, so effective, that means our total mortgage or rent for owning a home over those 13 years was $1,714. All right, so now let's break it down to this side of the board and look about, now what if we rent instead? Okay, so when I was doing the research again, kind of the median rental prices for a similar home is around $2,850. Rents have really gone up over the last many years as well. But this is the rental rate for a very similar $440,000 home. All right. So yes, today your rent is $2,850 per month. That's lower than our $3,940 per month over here. But remember, this $2,650 on a mortgage, it's fixed over the 13 years. But what if your rent goes up on average, that 3% inflation rate over the 13 years, what that means is that by year 13, your rent at the 3% inflation is $4,185. So it went from $2,850 to $4,185 just because inflation, your rent goes up as inflation goes up. If it follows that 3%. So that's the difference. Right here, we're fixed, but over here, your rent is going to follow inflation. Now, if we average that out over the 30 years, where it just averages, just 3% year over year, what that does is this takes us to $3,470 of average rent. So when we just look at the rent, again, if we just paid principal and interest, rent is a lot more than principal interest, but we have all these other costs when we own a home. So far it's looking like, yeah, the average rent is lower than our kind of average outlay when it comes to owning a home. But let's break this down even more. So we're looking at here, remember I said to remember this number? This is the cash to buy a house. So that's the opportunity cost that if we're putting that cash into our house, we can't, for example, invest that money elsewhere. But when we're renting our property, the landlord's usually going to collect the first month's rent and deposit as cash outlay. So what I did here to try to keep this as even and balanced as possible, I took the $30,800 cash. That's what we'd have to do if we bought a home at that 5% down. And I subtracted the first month's rent and the deposit of the $5,700 to find the difference. And that difference of cash, meaning if we rented versus bought, we would have $25,100 more cash in our pocket. So then what I looked at is, okay, if instead of putting this in my house over here, invest in the house, what if I put this $25,000 for it into the market and an index fund for 8%, and that would equal $66,000. So I take that $66,000 and I divide that over the 13 years, or 156 months. What that is that is $427 a month that I'd be basically earning from having that money invested. So we have to deduct that from the rent. So the effective rent here is this $34.70 from here. Now, if I had put that into the market, that would equal $427 a month, is $66,000. And then what that takes us down to $30,043. So this is now what our effective rent is when we can factor back in that if we'd invested that $25,000, it would be worth about $427 a month. So there we're looking at the rent here versus our rent here. But I decided I'd break it down even more. And this is one thing Ramit says. He said that, if you invested your money, the difference between the amount that you'd pay on owning and the difference of what you'd pay if you rented, then you'd probably do better if you rented versus bought. So I said, okay, let's see if that's true in this example. So now again, this was the opportunity cost. We could have invested this $25,000 and that would have turned into $66,000. And then that, would affect this monthly amount. But now let's also say that this average rent of $34.70 compared to our rent or our mortgage over here of $39.40. So I'm going to explain this so it's not confusing. So in this example, we're paying $39.40 every single month for the total cost of our outlay of our mortgage and all of the mortgage expenses. Now, our average rent over the 13 years is $34.70. So if I take $39.40 minus $34.70 right here, that's $470 a month. That means that our mortgage, owning a home, is costing us $470 a month effectively over the 13 years on average, more than our rent, because our rent is $34.70. So that means that we're paying $470 more a month to own a home as opposed to rent a home. But so for renting, what if we invested that $470 a month instead of putting into a mortgage? If we invested that $470 per month for 13 years, that would earn or equal at 8% in an index fund, $130,000. So now if I take that $130,000, I break it up by 13 years, 156 months, that is a total of $833 that then I'm going to deduct from here. And that puts us at, I'm going to use a red marker here, that puts us at $2210. So like I said, you could really pull this apart. But when I did this simple math, I'm looking at, oh my goodness, when I back out everything, the total effective cost of my rent to rent a home over the 13 years is $2210. And my total effective cost to own the house is $1714. And that even just there's a big difference in here between these two that even adjusts for maybe taxes going up and some expenses going up. And then let's just pretend now, in this example, how I played this out, effectively over the 13 years, it's less expensive to buy than it is to rent. But then here's my question. What if it's the same? What if to own a home was $2210 and to rent a home was $2210? Which one would you choose at the end of the day? I looked at this and I thought, okay, the math more or less proves my point that I say, if you can, figure out how to buy a home. And for these reasons alone, that do your own numbers, of course, but if you do your own numbers, discover for yourself, breaking it down like I just did, is it less expensive to buy on a monthly effective basis, or is it less expensive to own? So just look at those numbers. But then, like I said, we want to add on top that when you own a home, you pay it off in 30 years, which is the goal. You don't ever have to pay rent again. You own your home. And there's all the other benefits of home ownership. You can paint the walls and you can make it your own and you raise your family there. And with my kids, we had the little lines on how tall they were growing year over year. And you create memories there. And just there's that emotional effect of owning a home also that you don't necessarily get with renting. And again, ownership is not for everyone, but it's just to think about this in terms of the long-term benefits, the short-term benefits. And then here, you will own nothing and you will be happy. I'm just a proponent of ownership. So just a final couple thoughts as we wrap this long video up. And that is when I did just another simple math, and what I was looking at, okay, what over this 13-year example was the total amount that we paid in over the 13 years for owning our home. And that number is $568,000-ish. I think it's around there, 568, 570. So that's the total amount of money that we, over 13 years, that we spent on owning this home. Now, on the effective rent, how much was it for our effective rent? And our effective rent was $541,000. So we're looking at this, when you break it down over the 13 years, we spent $541,000 to rent, and that went directly to the landlord. And it paid off that landlord's mortgage. It paid off the landlord's mortgage, or 13 years of it, assuming that they'd bought it from day one. But if they owned it for 13 or more, you basically just paid off their mortgage. So your landlord's mortgage is paid off. You helped them pay it off by, pitching in this $541,000. And you put in $568,000 for owning a home. Not a big difference there at the end of the day. But one, you're getting close to owning your home if you were to keep it. In this case, like I said, you paid off the home for your landlord. That's interesting. Now, with here, your appreciation, like we talked about, if you owned your home, it would appreciate to 3%. It appreciate to about $650,000, for example. So right here, you have this amount of cash out, but it's worth $646. But you also have this $93,000 of principal. So if you were to sell this house, for example, just when we look at this, we had this gain of $206,000 from appreciation. Plus, you have that principal that you were paying down. So if you sold this house, for example, minus closing costs, you'd have this money that you could put in your pocket. So again, just another little layer of what you get when you own a home. Now over here, if you would have spent, around $541,000, this is, if you would have invested the difference, the total amount is your gain on the rental side over here would have been about $191,000. Had you invested all that money, and it would have appreciated or grown over time. So when I break this down, again, if you would have rented, you could have invested that money and walked away with $191,000 richer. By putting that same money in your house, you are $206,000 richer with appreciation. This is with interest on investing that entire amount of money. But here you also get that principal, that $97,000 back, because that was going towards you as the owner. This amount over here went towards the landlord. One final thought as we close here. Another thing that I looked at was that I did research, and I just said, based on overall net worth, is there like a wealth gap between those that own a home and those that rent? And yes, the statistics said that the average homeowner's net worth is around $250,000, and the average renter's net worth is around $6,000. So let's look at this. It's $250,000 of net worth for a homeowner, and it's $6,000 for a renter. You 40 times wealthier if you own a home. So when we break that down and just look at statistics, I love the whole idea that Ramit is talking about here when it's saying, no need to own a home. If you just invest that money in the market, you're going to do much better off. I think I've proven that you likely are not better off, but what he's saying, he's super disciplined, and he does rent his place, and he does invest his money. But what this statistic here tells us is that another kind of good, like a positive effect of owning a home is because you're putting that money into something that is appreciating and growing. Over here, renting, like, yes, this top rent here is less expensive monthly, but you're not putting that difference into the market and growing like I showed down here. You're spending that difference at the same income level. And that's why there's this here. So home ownership, yes, theoretically, at the end of the day, if you buy a home, it appreciates to $206,000. If you rent a home and put in, these opportunity costs here, it'd be worth $191,000. But this is going to happen automatically by owning a home. If you rent a home, there's very likely you're going to just flush this $191,000 down the commode. All right, that was a lot of numbers, a lot of math. Like I said, please be nice to me. Hopefully this made sense. Do your own math to find your own numbers. And I just like to conclude by saying, I want you to own everything and still be happy. All right, thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.